Hey guys, this is Ari, and welcome back to another episode of the Energy Blueprint podcast. I am super excited about today's episode. I have my good friend Alan Christianson, Dr. Christianson, with me today, who is, like me, very much a science geek. And we geek out all the time together on the phone and, on some of the trips we've taken together. And one of the things that we are both particularly passionate about is the science around carbs and fats. And this is a particularly troublesome, controversial area because there's a really big gap between what the science actually says about this topic and what are the common ideas floating around on the internet and in books about this subject. And we've really gotten to a kind of a critical mass here where certain things, certain ideas which are not rooted in science are so commonly believed that saying the truth, what the science actually says, gets you labeled as someone who doesn't know what they're talking about and is a liar and a scammer and all sorts of you're labeled as a whack job by just saying here's what the scientific evidence actually says. And so what I want to do in this episode is I want to talk about the science around carbs and fats and debunk a lot of myths here. And I also want to mention a couple warnings. Or a couple notes to be aware of. One is that because various diets are often like cults, they get taken so seriously that they become like religions where you have certain dogmas. These are the belief systems of your dietary cult. And then anyone who says anything other than that becomes someone to hang or burn at the stake or something. So I want to also mention that neither Dr. Christianson nor I take diet that seriously, where we have specific dogmas that we need you to believe in. We're just interested in what the science says. So having said that, this will piss some of you off, and just prepare for that if you have some specific diet that you believe in and it has some rigid dietary dogmas. We hope to maybe expose you to some ideas to help you be more flexible in your understanding of what the science actually says. And then finally, just to let you guys know, neither of us have any vested interest in promoting any particular macronutrient ratio of the diet. We have no specific carb to fat ratio of the diet we're trying to sell you on. Having said that, I would like to hand it over to Dr. C. And if you have any kind of intro thoughts to kind of open things up on this topic and maybe open people's minds to exploring some new ideas.
Awesome stuff. I agree with all of it. Also really jazzed to be here with you. This can be a lot of fun, and we'll see how long we keep on going before biological necessity slow us down, but we could talk a long time on these things.
Yeah, most definitely.
On the trail, it's easy to keep on going. Just turn to the side real quick or hydrate,
Yeah.
Anyway, so some other preface concepts. Like you said, there's a big gap between what is known and what is thought. What is thought becomes more anchored by repetition, regardless of its truth or not. And then also, it's important. These are really important, weighty questions. And some things you can see how they affect you over the short term. Some things you cannot. These things can affect long-term outcomes and mortality and disease risks, and it's not apparent. So this is hugely critical.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to preface the whole discussion with, which I think will orient a lot of things, is that so not all data is created equally. And by that, I don't mean that my data and Ari's data is better. I mean that there's ways you can categorize information. And in almost all cases, once you look at information as being in a hierarchy, almost all the conflicts just vanish. Because you can think about it as two big groups, as like really ideas and evidence. And evidence often is thought of as being such because someone of authority said it. But a big part of the Renaissance in science was that, hey, it's not about authorities. It's about things you can test and prove. So you can have concepts that can make sense, that can go viral, that can seem very inherently consistent, and that can look like evidence. But it's really not. That's really an idea or a concept, or the word theory is used in different ways in scientific circles versus in the public. But when the public talk about it, they mean just theorizing, like, without a lot of weight behind it, speculating concepts. And that's what a lot of that modeling is, to whereas evidence is really, what happened, what actually happened from studies. And so the difficulty is that this ideation is just so much more apt to go viral by its very nature. It's simple concepts. It's quick lines. It's, insulin, carbs make you fat. Insulin does this. All the foods that we ate after 8,000 BC are bad. It's these simple concepts. But the problem is that that's not how evidence works. We have to talk about just actual outcomes and actual studies. And it's not as easy to package in all cases. Quick generalization about this hierarchy, the lower portion, which I would lump together into ideas, would be, first off, just concepts. Things like the foods that we've eaten more recently than 8,000 BC are bad. So that's a concept. And you can take steps up in terms of concepts based upon if there's consensus, if experts put them together. But that's still the bottom of the rung. No matter how many big experts you have in full agreement, we're at the very bottom of the rung here. The next step up would be what we call more so in vitro data, or data from test tubes. And you can see chemical analysis about things where cells will act in a certain way, and a ton of anything mixed onto a cell will cause cancer for it. And then we think above that about animal data. And everything down here is not worth jettisoning. That's not what I'm saying. This is all good stuff. And this is all things that if we see dangers or warnings from ideas, test tube studies, animal studies, or if something looks really exciting, maybe that's the basis for good research. Maybe we should inspire evidence about that. So this is good stuff, but this is not really actionable. The odds of something coming from down here and coming up into a clear action step from good documentation, it's usually less than about 1 in a million. I mean, no kidding, things as they filter up. So above that, we think about more so actual outcome studies. The lower levels being epidemiologic, just tracking lots of people, and the higher levels being interventional, where you actually do something and watch group differences. And I see a lot of times in which epidemiologic studies take flack, like, oh, they're not valid for many reasons. And it's really true. There's a lot of shortcomings of all kinds of data. But the point to bear in mind is that the shortcomings are even greater further down, further down in the level of ideation.
Yeah.
So big picture concept, we're going to really stick to more so the top part of this hierarchy, and that clarifies so many things that are otherwise controversial.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to elaborate on that, at the top level of this hierarchy of scientific evidence, we get into really well-designed randomized controlled studies where they're controlling for all the different variables. And then on top of that, the systematic literature reviews and meta-analyses of all of the studies. And that's a key point, because by doing that, we're avoiding what's called cherry picking. And cherry picking is, for those that are not familiar with this term, is something that is rampant in the health and nutrition space online. And basically, it's where one particular health or nutrition guru says, this is the right way to do things, and then here's the 3 studies that say that this is scientifically proven. And, I just to kind of follow up and make sense of what you were saying, Alan, that there's this difference between opinions and facts, and opinions and evidence. And basically, it's possible to take any particular dietary view and find at least 1 or 2 or 10 studies that support that view. Okay. And it's also possible simultaneously to take the completely polar opposite view and find 5 or 10 studies that support that view. And so we have all these competing ideologies that are all cherry picking the data to find the specific studies that support their views while leaving out all of the ones that don't. And it confuses the hell out of people, because we have all these average people who are not science geeks, who don't have time to spend to go through thousands of studies, who are hearing from one person, this is scientifically proven, and then from someone else, the polar opposite, and then from someone else, something completely different, and someone else completely different. So what we really want to get across to everyone listening is there's a hierarchy of evidence. And what we're looking for is something where at every step of this hierarchy, and by the way, if you want to Google image search the hierarchy of scientific evidence, I'd recommend that so you can get a visual on what we're talking about here. But what we're looking for is where all the full body of scientific evidence really starts to align and point in a particular direction. And then when that full body of evidence that is non-cherry picked starts to point in a particular direction, that's when we go, okay, now we have a sense of what is, quote unquote truth, or the most strongest evidence that the science has.
Can I expand on the cherry picking just a little tiny bit?
Please.
So
yes.
I think that's so important. And think about baseball. So I'm not a sports expert, so if I come off like an idiot, don't be surprised. But so a batter, imagine that batters could not count 9 times out of 10 that they go to bat. So you wouldn't know who's good and who's not. They could pick. They could say, yeah, that one last week where I hit that home run, that's how I bat.
I hit a home run 100% of the time.
That's right. 100% of the time I hit homers. And
Yeah.
someone else could say, yeah, but that one time the week before you struck out. So 100% of the time there you failed. Like, well, no, we put all of it together into a batting average.
Yeah.
And that's the composite score. And that's what Ari was talking about with the higher reviews and meta-analysis, to where it's a compilation of the data, not just the 1 or 2 studies. And to even go further too, so often they will pick out 1 or 2 odd studies that are not even human studies, or not even living thing studies. And also about how you can find studies supporting anything. If you go a step further down and talk about this modeling of biochemistry, boy, you could make up anything at all, no problem, and make it sound good, make it sound plausible.
Yeah. Oh yeah, the armchair theorizing, when people go down to the biochemical mechanisms, and so molecule increases with so thing, therefore do this.
So we had a biochemical map on the wall in med school in one of our classrooms. And one professor would do that. He would start here and take all these steps, pull in a nutrient or botanical and pull out a disease process. And at first I was mesmerized. I'm like, wait a minute, you can make up anything you want.
Yeah.
And it may or may not be meaningful.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that note, there's a scientist who I really like, an anti-aging specialist named Vince Giuliano. Really, really smart guy in the realm of aging science. And there's a talk, actually a free talk online that he gave, really fascinating, on the science of longevity. And at the beginning of his talk, he talks about all those biochemistry maps, all those if you guys haven't seen this, it's picture like one molecule in the center, and then like 500 arrows going off in various directions to 500 other molecules, and some arrows pointing this way and that way and going both ways simultaneously. And, this inhibits that and this activates this. And one of the things he actually shows like 20 different biochemical maps in the beginning of his presentation. And he says these maps don't even match up with one another. They can't even agree on what is doing what. Yeah. So, let alone, extrapolate out, to the level of behavioral interventions. And
well, I had a physiology professor who would make fun of that whole world. He'd say, oh, those are mechanisms. You can sure, if you want mechanisms, you can have those, but they change whenever new studies come out. This is our best explanation for what studies showed us, but it's just the study outcomes that matter.
Yeah. So hopefully you guys get all this concept of the hierarchy of evidence, cherry picking, and the warning of not to be offended by anything we say. And so with all of that said, let's get into some of the meat of this conversation. And I think a good entry point in this conversation is what causes fat gain. Now, and in the context of, we have lots of ideas floating around now. Fat doesn't make you fat, carbs make you fat, or sugar makes you fat. And insulin is a fat storing hormone. And therefore, things which boost insulin, that's the cause of fat gain. And really there's this whole thing called the carbohydrate and insulin theory of obesity, which has primarily been popularized by Gary Taubes. And that basically says it's not really calories that are making us fat, it's insulin. And insulin is produced by carbohydrates. Therefore, carbohydrates are really the things that are driving obesity. Now, there's a lot of layers to dissect here as far as different levels of evidence that we can use to assess the validity of this argument. But do you have any kind of intro thoughts to get us into this?
An intro thought, I would talk about a big generalizing concept is about how, think about these macronutrients and think about their contribution to fuel. And the main ones we want to talk about are going to be carbs and fats, but also relevant would be alcohols, including ketones, and then also protein. So ultimately, your body converts fuel down to one common thing. This was, I think, more common in my generation, but the joke was that kids would get concerned about their food mixing up, and mom said, well, it all goes in the same place. Don't worry if you got mashed potatoes and your green beans, because it all gets mixed together in your stomach. So when it comes to fuel in the body, that same place would be just the energy metabolism, or the Krebs cycle. And all those different macros, they convert down into acetyl-CoA. They all burn down to the exact same stuff. And either they get brought into the cell, they're kept outside the cell, they go into the mitochondria, they're kept out of the mitochondria, and they're going to be burned, or they're going to be converted to a storage compound, most commonly glycogen, and then eventually triglyceride. So no matter what it is, that's what it comes down to. And the difference is that whether you need more fuel because you've not consumed enough, or you're burning more because of your basal metabolic rate, your activity levels, thermogenesis, or how well you can burn fuel in terms of the endoplasmic reticulum, the mitochondria, how well your body is capable of handling that fuel. So those three variables determine whether you've got too little fuel or too much. And if there's too much, you've got to reject it and store it, and that gums things up.
Yeah. Beautiful. So carbs versus fat, like what can we draw from the science to assess whether it's true that carbs are uniquely making us fat, are uniquely fattening, or insulin specifically is the primary mechanism that is driving the epidemic of obesity?
Well, in terms of carbs specifically, there's been several good studies that have looked at how different ratios of diets have played out over longer periods of time, like how the rubber meets the road. And kind of interesting, the groups on high carb, low carb, high fat, low fat, or more moderate type diets, they end up doing about the same over longer periods of time. Mm-hmm. But curiously, when you look within the groups and you pull out individual scores, on every one of those diets, there's some people that do quite well in terms of weight loss goals, and then others that do not do as well. They actually have weight gain. And I think another important thing that we should mention too is a distinction between weight changes and then composition changes. Yeah. Because the science is so strong that weight is not an important predictor. Your simple waist circumference, your waist to height is probably one of the biggest ones as far as predicting your health span and mortality risk. But yeah, the overall ratios from the largest studies by themselves don't seem to be big differentiators. And if it were solely a matter of carbohydrate being the culprit, what you would expect to see is that the lower someone went on carbs, the more weight loss they would see. And the higher they were on carbs, the less weight loss they would see. It should rank up in a fashion like that. And that's just not been the case.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll add a few specific kind of layers of evidence on this point. One is to go into, in the context of the hierarchy of evidence, I'll kind of go into a few layers here. One is epidemiological research. So we could look at different populations around the world. And one of the simple predictions that would come out of a theory like this is, well, if we look at populations that have, 60 or 70% of their diet is carbohydrates, and other populations are eating 20 or 35% of their diet is carbohydrates, the ones eating more carbs should be fatter, right? And so this is epidemiological evidence. By itself doesn't tell you the whole story, but it's an important layer of evidence. And so what we find when we look into those studies is that there's basically no correlation at all. We find lots and lots of populations all over the world that have carb-based diets, where as long as they're eating their traditional diets and they're eating whole foods and relatively unprocessed stuff, they are lean and pretty much disease-free. And there is certainly no obesity epidemic, and usually in most populations, there's zero obesity at all or very close to zero. And there's no significant difference in these populations between higher carb versus lower carb populations. And we have lots of examples of research, really good research that's been done in the last few decades on this topic, where certain researchers have gone out and studied hunter-gatherer tribes in various parts of the world, in Africa and South America, in the South Pacific, and so on, and basically analyzed their diet, exactly what they're eating, the macronutrient ratios, carbs to fats, and all of that. And then found out, they went and saw, what's the rate of obesity, what's the rate of diabetes, what's the rate of cardiovascular disease, and so on. And a lot of these tribes are eating 70%, in some cases 80 or even 94% in some cases, carbohydrate in their diet. Some of these populations like the Tukisenta in Papua New Guinea are eating 94% carbohydrate in their diet. It's basically all sweet potatoes.
Right.
The Kitavans in the South Pacific have a 69% ratio of carbohydrate. The Tarahumara Indians have, I think, 75%.
Samame were way up there. They were like 69, 70%.
Yeah, the Hadza in Africa. They're on and on and on. A lot of these tribes are eating carb-based diets and yet have no obesity. So that's kind of one layer that we could explore that really shows whether this theory has validity or not. And so I'd say in that first layer, it really points to no real indication that carbs are causing obesity.
Well, and we can think about obesity. I don't want to juxtapose too many topics. You did talk also about just heart disease and other diseases. I think you can consider longevity as like one of the biggest factors, that whatever else happened, if you died, it wasn't good.
Right.
And the opposite. And we've got, Dan Buettner's data on the blue zones and about the populations they tracked that had disproportionately higher rates of centenarians. Yeah. And it's not that everyone lived to be some crazy old age, but within large numbers of people, the rate of living to 100 might be 1 in 2 or 3,000 rather than 1 in 20 or 30,000. So it was a big deal. And all of those 4 areas were starch-based diets. They were consuming high starch diets. And the one group that had the highest rate of centenarians amongst males, which was unusual, in most cases it was higher amongst females, that would have been in Italy, off of Gapping on the island.
Sardinia.
Yeah, thank you so much. Sardinia. And these were all pastoral groups, and their diet was roughly 60% bread, 60 or more percent bread.
Yeah.
And they had the greatest rates. So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, again, that population level epidemiological studies, the blue zones, the healthiest populations in the world are eating carb-based diets. In most cases, with a couple examples of the Mediterranean diet, where it's more moderate carb, moderate fat. Mm-hmm. But none of the populations in the world that are known for being the healthiest and longest lives are on low carb diets.
And further along those lines, there has been a lot of talk about how the Inuit or the Maasai had higher fat diets and great health. And when you look a little more deeply at their health histories, that claim doesn't stand up. There was a large review from 2003 that was looking at the claim about the Inuits having, the Eskimos having these low rates of heart disease, and there's not really evidence for that. Amongst Native Americans in general, they've often had high rates of chronic disease, and the Inuits, even going back as long as we have good records, their rates were consistent with other groups of Native Americans, but even a little bit worse than other groups were.
Yeah. And just to go a little deeper into that one specifically, we also have this narrative of the Inuit diet being kind of this ideal diet. Part of it's based on the idea that they were supremely healthy. There's also these kind of myths around how they were able to achieve these amazing feats of performance and so on. And therefore, and this is kind of invoked as evidence for the benefits of low carb or ketogenic eating. And I think it's worthwhile to note that there was actually research done on the Inuit eating their traditional diet to assess whether their diet was actually ketogenic. And they found that it wasn't. They found that actually the Inuit people, despite eating basically blubber and like almost an all animal food and super high fat diet, since plants don't grow, where it's all ice, they found that even in that condition, they were still getting enough carbohydrates and protein in their diet to keep them out of ketogenesis. So there's literally no population group on Earth that eats a ketogenic diet as their standard diet, which I think is an interesting point, considering that we hear so many people kind of advocating for low carb ketogenic eating as this sort of state of our ancestors, or
Right.
what traditional man ate. And there's just no indication that that is true.
You talked about it being almost like a religion or a cult. And what happens in a group when they have beliefs about, here's what we do, here's the dance we do to make it rain. So if it doesn't rain, we weren't dancing hard enough, or maybe Joe stayed behind in his tent and didn't show up that day. We had a shortcoming. So the cycle is that when low carb didn't yield the benefits we expected, we weren't low carbing enough. So we've got to go keto.
Yeah, and that's where that's where the low carb movement went all the way into keto. And I've even seen more recently, I've seen people there's a new movement called zero carb.
Oh, it's actually a movement. I've seen a website of a zero carb diet, but now it's a movement. Okay, I guess that's...
Yeah. So now people have established that keto isn't quite extreme enough, so that we need to get even the few grams of carbohydrates that are in the diet all the way out to get into the real magic zone. So anyway, we kind of went on a little digression there, but back to this carbohydrate theory of obesity. One more layer of evidence that I think is useful to go into here. A couple layers, actually. One is just animal studies where they've done direct manipulating of insulin levels, like through various drugs like clonidine and stuff like that. So you put rats or dogs on a fattening diet that makes them obese, and then you give them a drug like clonidine that manipulates their insulin levels, so that artificially lowers their insulin levels, and you see if that affects the rate of fat gain. And there's also been studies where they've genetically manipulated insulin levels in rats and so on. And over, what they find in those animal models is that manipulating insulin signaling or insulin levels in that way doesn't actually affect the rate of fat gain. And then the final, most important layer of evidence that I think is worthwhile getting into is the metabolic ward studies and the overfeeding studies. And I know that you paid attention to the recent ones that came out funded by Gary Taubes's institute.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that a lot. Can I, right back after the animal studies you mentioned,
yes.
One brief thing about humans. And sometimes what's ideation, or what's almost like the thought type studies, sometimes they're just not done thoroughly. So the idea about insulin causing weight gain, the basic idea there is that insulin is an energy signaling molecule, and it does have roles to play in how cells take in energy. And so the thought process is that high levels of insulin make the body resistant to insulin, and they create this state of insulin resistance, which in turn causes you to make more insulin. So it's thought that then this vicious cycle ensues, which caused your body just to have everything get vacuumed up into the fat cells. And one shortcoming about that from human studies, just working as an endocrinologist and managing many who are diabetic, we'll see type 1, type 2 diabetics. Type 2 diabetics, their bodies do produce insulin, and generally have got very high levels of insulin. And if you take someone like that who's not responsive to medication, they're at a critical state, and you give them, we call that exogenous, or from outside of the body, give them exogenous insulin, if this theory was true, things should get worse. That extra insulin should worsen that resistance and should make everything just cycle further. But it doesn't. We give them some extra insulin. Now their blood sugar comes down. It can improve their metabolic rate. They can lose weight easier, and those things can become positive. So insulin is not the driver of all of this. It's really just a molecule that's signaling something that's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for adding that. So I guess the most direct means in humans, the highest levels of evidence that we can look at as far as individual studies are these metabolic ward studies. And to give you all a little insight or a little explanation into what these are, basically they are studies where they take people and they put them in a chamber, and then they precisely control calories. So it's not in a real world setting where people are allowed to do whatever they want and eat whatever they want.
What I ate last week.
Yeah, exactly. They're not reporting based on memory what they ate. Scientists are literally controlling every morsel of food that these people are eating, and they're measuring how many calories they're burning. So every last calorie is controlled for. Now, there's been several studies, metabolic ward studies, going back a few decades now, But actually the biggest, most well-controlled ones just came out in the last year and a half, 2 years. And interestingly enough, were actually funded by Gary Taubes's institute called Nusi, which again, if you guys don't know, Gary Taubes is the guy, again, the primary guy who's popularized the low carb movement. Now, he's funded this institute and got a lot of millionaires to invest in it to fund this research with basically the explicit goal of proving that low carb is the best way to lose fat, and that insulin is the primary cause of obesity or fat gain. And this Nusi, this institute, has now funded a couple of these metabolic ward studies, these really well-designed, tightly controlled studies. And they've basically put these people in a chamber. And then to give you guys the basic gist of this, basically they take one group of people and they put them on a diet that's, let's say, 70 or 75% carbohydrate. And they take another group of people and they put them on a diet that is the exact same number of calories, but is, let's say, 5% or 10% carbohydrate instead of 70 or 75%. Okay. And then they do this for several weeks or several days, or several weeks. And then afterwards, they simply assess, okay, well, has this big change in carbohydrates and insulin actually affected fat loss? And do you want to talk a little about the results on that one?
Yeah, the most recent one was pretty fascinating. They were looking at the effects of a ketogenic diet. And I should briefly define ketogenic versus ketosis. So I talked about how all those types of macronutrients become acetyl-CoA. And if you have oxaloacetate from carbs or protein, you can burn that for fuel in the liver and the mitochondria, elsewhere in the body. But if you don't have enough carbs or protein, then you can't get those in the liver properly. So you make those into ketone bodies, which then circulate. They can't be burned by your liver, but they're burned elsewhere. And they're either burned or they're converted to fat. So anytime you're running low fuel, low calorie of any combination, vegan, high carb, low carb, paleo, whatever it is, if you're low fuel, when you run out of glycogen in your liver and your muscles, you'll start making ketones. And that's metabolic ketosis. It's just not enough fuel. Most of us are mildly in that state just from overnight fast when we wake up in the morning. But then ketogenic is to where there's not a fuel deficit, but there's so little carbohydrate and protein that all you can do is turn that stuff into ketones. So this study was looking at a ketogenic diet, which, funny thing, they weren't expecting there to be weight loss. They wanted to look at changes in metabolism, at how the body was burning fats and carbs and insulin output. And they put this group of people on about 2,700 calories. And they did end up losing weight, which is pretty fascinating and telling about metabolic wards, because most would think that they would not lose weight on 2,700 calories. But in the real world, in an actual scientific setting, where you honestly are getting that much, that ended up being less than they thought in terms of how it affected people.
Yeah.
And there was weight loss that occurred. Funny thing too is that there was more fat burned in those who were in the ketogenic group, but we've got to distinguish fat burned from the diet and fat burned from the body. So
I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah.
They burned more fat in total, but they actually burned less fat from their bodies. So if you poured kerosene in your car's burning kerosene. You didn't have to change your car, so that's all it's got to run on. So when all you're eating is fat, you'll burn fat, but you're not burning your fat.
Yeah, and I want to dig into that a little deeper. This was one of the points that I really wanted to dig into on this podcast with you, because there's so many misconceptions on this that I think it's worth really emphasizing this more. We often hear this narrative of, you don't want to be a carb burner or a sugar burner, you want to be a fat burner. And in order to be a fat burner, you have to eat fat. You have to eat fat to burn fat. And people think if they're a fat burner, if they're a fat burning machine, that they will all of a sudden lose lots of fat. And therefore, by eating fat and becoming a fat burner, it will result in all of these amazing fat loss benefits. And
it'll trigger some kind of a chain reaction that gets out of control and burns up all their fat mysteriously too.
Exactly. Well, there's a real semantic issue that kind of, I think, disrupts our thinking process here. because we talk about dietary fat and body fat using the same word, fat.
Yeah.
And so there's a confusion and a blurring of the lines that I think for the human brain, it's hard to grasp that these are distinct things. So I think to make this more clear cut, let's just say as an example, you put two people on a calorie restricted diet. Both are eating, let's say 1,300 calories a day. One person is getting 1,300 calories a day from bread, and the other person's getting it from butter. Okay. One of those people, the butter eater, is going to be a fat burning machine. But as we know from these metabolic ward studies, when we control precisely for the amount of calories, it doesn't actually matter at the end of the day whether you're eating 1,300 calories from a carb dominant diet or 1,300 calories from a fat dominant diet.
As far as body fat loss, yeah.
The body fat loss is the same. So yes, you're a fat burner, but you have to burn through 1,300 calories of butter before you burn off your body fat.
And that's where I was talking earlier about how all the fats, the carbs, they become acetyl-CoA, and they all come down to this ultimately the same thing before they go into the furnace. And it's just how much of that have you got?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and so just to tie this up, basically these overfeeding studies, even the ones conducted by Gary Taubes' institute, have all been extremely consistent that when matched for calories, it doesn't matter whether your diet is 75% carbs or 5% carbs. The fat loss, the body fat loss is the same.
Well, the NUSI study, the more recent one, was looking at an actual ketogenic diet. They were in a state of ketosis. It was calorie controlled. The opposing diet was honestly a straw man. It was set up to fail. It was like 25% sugar amongst all those carbs. And when you got down in the details, the sugar diet lost a little more fat than the ketogenic diet did.
A little more body
fat, thank you. It wasn't enough to where it would be a huge difference, but overall, there was definitely not an advantage by going low carb.
Yeah, I actually like to be generous when I explain this study to people and say that they lost the same amount of fat.
They didn't.
Because it's so hard for people. I feel people will be skeptical of me and think that I'm telling them some lie if I tell them that the carb-based group actually lost slightly more body fat. To be honest, it was small enough that it's pretty close to the same. It's not that statistically significant, but I just leave that part out because I feel it makes people less skeptical of the information.
I'm just throwing the salt in.
Yes. Well, we're having the podcast. That's why we're here. So last point I want to add on this is that interestingly enough, there's also been, I believe, 3 or 4 overfeeding metabolic ward studies. And in contrast to the studies we were just referring to, where they're putting people on a calorie restricted diet and matching for calories, in this context, they're actually putting people on a calorie surplus diet. And they're basically forcibly overfeeding them with the intention to get them fatter. And they put them on 2 different diets, basically the same idea. One, a very high carb, low fat diet, and the other one, a very high fat, low carb diet. And what they find in these studies is basically the same, that when overfed a certain number of calories, you will gain the exact same amount of fat, regardless of whether you were on the high carb or high fat study. And again, here, there's a little bit of salt, which is, if anything, there was actually a slightly greater fat gain in the high fat groups in at least some of those studies. But I like to say overall, it's basically the same.
And I don't know if this is the best point to throw this one in the mix, but protein's relevant too. And I've seen some overfeeding studies in which they've tracked differing levels of protein. And you can make a strong generalization like we have that fats and carbs, not a big difference as far as scale weight goes for change, but protein does seem to be distinct. And that's why I left it out of that fuel definition, because I've seen overfeeding studies where they gave people intentionally about an extra 1,000 calories per day. And 3 groups, one group was on what would be a lower protein, could be a vegetarian, vegan diet, like 7 to 10% calories from protein. One was on the typical American diet, like 12 to 15% protein. And then one was a dedicated higher protein diet, 30, 35% calories. And what this overfeeding study showed was that there was the weight gain differences were not huge, but there was the most weight gain just in terms of scale weight on the lowest amount of protein. Now, the lowest amount of protein, I'm not exactly correct, but I'm close. I'm going to make up the numbers. There was about 11 pounds of weight gain, but there was actually 13 pounds of fat gain. So as the people were gaining weight, they were losing muscle tissue. Your body requires somewhere at least about like 10 to 12% calories from protein just to function. And if you get less than that, you got to make up that difference from your muscle tissue. So the moderate group, they gained more equal amounts of fat and muscle. I'm sorry, not equal, but a little more, some muscle and then some fat. And then the high protein group mostly gained muscle. They did gain some fat. But I thought about that, like, so the calories pretty much ruled the scale, but the protein might have ruled the mirror, because these people might not have looked worse afterwards. These folks definitely looked worse.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for adding that. So on that note, there's one other important layer of evidence that I think we'd be remiss for not mentioning here, which is the non-metabolic ward studies. And this is where we have a mixed bag of some confusing research. And this is where the low carb advocates like to cite evidence from. So this is where they take, for example, a high protein, high fat, low carb diet and compare it to a low protein, high carb, low fat diet.
Yep.
Okay. So what I'm saying by that, what I'm saying there for those that didn't quite catch it is protein is not controlled for. Calories are not controlled for. You're allowing people to eat whatever they want in a real world setting without controlling their calorie intake, without controlling their protein intake. And in some of those studies, low carb diets actually turn out to be superior. And at least in the short term. And for a couple reasons as to why this happens. When we look at it in the long term, 6 months, out 12 months, in general, the differences are very, very minor between low carb and low fat diets, even when not controlling for calories or protein. But in the short term, when you don't control for calories, you don't control for protein, what happens on a lot of these low carb diets is people end up eating more protein. They drop a lot of the processed foods, and they are, as a result of eating more protein, we have the effect that you just talked about, which is they retain or build muscle mass. And so more of the fat loss comes from fat, more of the weight loss comes from fat and less from muscle tissue. And protein has a couple of other effects. One, it increases dietary thermogenesis or post-meal thermogenesis, which is the number of calories burned after the meal. And then probably the most significant is that it decreases appetite. Of all of the 3 macronutrients, it decreases your desire to eat more food more strongly than either carbs or fats. And quick note, there's a lot of kind of popular ideas around fat is really satiating. Yeah. Actually, the research doesn't really support the idea that fat and carbs are much different in terms of satiation, but protein is uniquely satiating. And so a higher protein diet will cause overall less calorie consumption, and that will be more effective in driving fat loss.
The term that some researchers use is caloric offset. So if you take a meal and you add in 100 calories from chicken, for example, what is that person going to have the rest of the day? You track them and let them eat what they want. You see how many calories they eat. And just to make the point, if they add in 100 more calories from lean poultry, for example, they're probably going to offset about 150 calories spontaneously. Now, the opposite extreme of that would be, the most dramatic would be sodas, to where there's probably no caloric offset, if any. You add in a couple hundred calories from a soda, and that person's still going to take in just as many calories as they would have otherwise. So that's one of the few examples of liquid calories, like sodas especially, to where there's no real caloric offset. But foods almost always have some caloric offset, even junk foods, but protein seems to have the most caloric offset, unit per unit.
Yeah.
Have you seen the satiety study, that one particular one that was done?
I'm not sure which one you're referring to.
There was one, I think it was called the satiety study, and they gave people access to controlled amounts of certain foods, large numbers of different foods in different intervals, and then they tracked them for how soon they consumed the next meal and how much they ate at the next meal. And they ranked about 50 some odd foods on a satiety scale. And it was pretty fascinating. It really bore out what you were saying, and that fats were some of the least satiating. But the winner by a long shot was potatoes.
Yeah. I do remember coming across that. Yeah. Yeah. Fascinating. So
potatoes were a huge outlier. I mean, like there was this whole rank of foods about like this, and potatoes were like all by themselves way out there.
Yeah. Fascinating. So I want to just dig in a little bit more to fat loss and low carb diets and the mechanisms behind it. If it's, what we just kind of went through was that insulin and the carb insulin thing really clearly isn't the mechanism, because we have lots of evidence, many lines of evidence showing that it's, clearly showing that it's not true. So what is the mechanism when someone goes on a low carb diet and a low carb paleo diet, and then they lose weight spontaneously, even while eating to fullness, they start to lose weight. So what's going on there? And we know that person, if they just read a paleo low carb diet book or just a low carb Atkins or whatever, that they're inclined to think, wow, it's from removing the carbs and lowering my insulin levels. That's why I'm losing fat. So what are the real mechanisms behind that?
One brief thing I would love to throw out as just a devil's advocate, so to speak, for some communities is that everything you talk about that can happen for paleo testimonials, you can find those same things for vegan testimonials.
Yeah.
For those that have gone vegan or raw food or high starch, low fat diets, you find all the same cures and benefits and diabetes and weight. So what's really happening? So ultimately, they're consuming, they've probably shifted their fuel to nutrient ratio, and they're consuming less overall fuel. So most human spontaneous diets are about half carbohydrate, and most of that comes from starch. We get carbs from starch or from simple carbohydrates, and this starch is primarily grains, legumes, tubers, and the others are primarily fruits or processed foods. And when you cut out this whole big category of foods, your fuel intake, your caloric intake has plummeted, because that's usually at least about 3/4 of that half of the diet. So we're talking like almost 40% of the caloric intake is just off the board. And the cycle that happens whenever you cut a food category is that at first you're staying true to eating more or less as much of the other foods as you did before. But then over time there's some drift. And the drift is that you start finding the cheats, the workarounds, the processed low carb foods. Or you start changing your quantity of the foods you had that are still left over. And that's where it quits working and even reverses to some extent. Yeah. And that's true of all diets where you cut out a category of foods.
Yeah. And, just to phrase that in other words so people really get this, the vast majority of the typical Western diet is from processed carb-rich foods. And so when you go on a diet that immediately eliminates all of those foods that were maybe 40, 50, 60% of your overall calorie intake, you're eliminating, half or a majority of the calories that you were normally getting in your diet. And just by that alone, you will spontaneously reduce the overall amount of calories that you're consuming pretty dramatically in some cases. And cause fat loss. But as you also mentioned, we see these same things occurring when you eliminate processed foods on vegan diets, on the Mediterranean diet, on the zone diet, on whatever carb to fat macronutrient ratio of the diet. You can get these same amazing weight loss testimonials, and it largely comes down to removal of different food groups, and they may even be contradictory food groups between different diets, and especially removal of processed foods.
And one thing to talk about too, in terms of long-term success for weight loss, there's been an unholy convergence of two incompatible ideas over these last several years. One of which has been that carbs are bad. The other idea has been that your microflora is important and that we need these healthy bugs. There's more data saying that these can be bigger predictors of weight than anything else can be. The ratios of certain types can be relevant. And it's almost like saying gardening is a good idea, but don't use water. Because ultimately the flora is fed off of carbohydrate and carbohydrate remnants solely. And fats and proteins do not serve the types of flora that we're interested in preserving and amplifying.
Yeah. Absolutely. And yeah, and I think that's a good point to add. And we hear a lot of people talking about the importance of gut microbiome, but very few people mentioning that, and mentioning also that we actually have quite a bit of data showing high fat diets actually disturb the gut microbiome.
Mm-hmm. And even a little further along those lines, fiber is talked about as if it is an entity, and it's really a category. And you can think about at least 16 different main categories of dietary fiber. And once you drop out starches, tubers, legumes, intact whole grains, you've now lost about a dozen of those categories of fiber.
Wow.
So you lose the diversity of your whole flora.
Yeah. Yeah, fascinating stuff. So a couple other points on this whole carbohydrate theory of insulin or carbohydrate theory of fat gain that I want to add that I think are worth mentioning. One is that we have this narrative of the low fat era. So we commonly hear this idea of, oh, we had the low fat movement in the 80s and 90s. And it didn't work, and we all went low fat, and we just got sicker and fatter as a result of going low fat. So, and the real secret, now that we tried that experiment and we know that didn't work, the real reason is because it turns out that fat really isn't bad, and really carbs were the thing that was problematic. Yep. So it sounds like you know where I'm going with this. Do you want to elaborate on that?
For sure. So that's totally the narrative. And you can look at what the population's intake was in two different ways. You can look at our percentage of calories or our absolute amounts of those macronutrients. And in terms of our percent calories, we went a tad lower fat. I don't think I'm off by much. I think it was like 37 to 34% calories from fat over that time frame, something about like that.
Yeah, that's about right.
Okay, so we went down slightly by percent calories from fat, and like you said, the obesity trends kept on going and kept on getting worse as we went lower fat. But the problem is that was a percentage of calories, and it didn't take into account our total caloric intake. So the short version of what happened was that everyone had their diet for what it was, and they heard the low-fat message, and they said, oh, these fat-free foods are good, so they added processed fat-free foods on top of their diet. They never changed their diet. They never ate less of anything else. They just added more processed carbs on top of their diet. So their total fat intake never went down. It didn't change at all. But they added more on top, so the percent went down by a smudge. So we never really had a low-fat experiment.
Yes, yeah, thank you. And I have to say, this is so fun that I can provide a little intro like that, and you know exactly, you know exactly the research that I'm referring to. So that's awesome. So yeah, just to reemphasize that, if there's a difference between absolute grams of fat consumption versus relative. So what actually happened during these years of the so-called low-fat era is we actually slightly increased our overall fat intake, but the relative amount, since the overall calories we were consuming went up dramatically, the relative amount, the percentage of that total calories that was from fat decreased very slightly. So basically people twist the data to create this narrative, in support of low carb diets, saying we all went on these low fat diets and they didn't work. They just made us fatter. And therefore, really you need to go low carb. And
there's thought of a way to maybe make it even clearer is that my son, I'm going to make up some numbers. He's got like 40 kids in his class, and half of them are girls. There's 20 girls and 20 boys. So if he had 20 more boys come in his class, all of a sudden the percentage of girls went down. But there's just as many girls there.
Exactly. So basically people are twisting this data to make it seem like we did something that we didn't. There was no low fat era where millions of people adopted low fat diets and got fatter as a result. This did not happen. It is totally just a false narrative that has no basis in actual science.
And the funny thing is that along those lines, I remember being such a health nut during that time, and I remember seeing the responses and just the pervasiveness of that dogma. And it's just such an obvious parallel where we are today. I remember a couple of vignettes. I remember after a race one time, there was a Everyone had the bagels out, which was totally normal. They're passing around the bagels. We did a running event. And some person was pretty heretical. They had mixed cream cheese and brown sugar to put in the bagels. Like, whoa, yeah, but this is so good. Like after a race, just have a little bit. And this one gal, she was just being thin. And she had her big stack of bagels, and she took one little smudge of the stuff. She goes, okay, that's my fat grams for the day.
Yeah, that's weird. So yeah, just as another point to add on this, we also have actual studies where people have been put on low-fat diets. Oftentimes these low-fat diets are vegan diets. And when they're put on whole food, low-fat diets, we actually do have solid research showing that these people do lose weight. They do improve their health biomarkers. And so, again, just to reemphasize that a lot of this narrative that's been built around the villainization of low fat and of carbs specifically really is not well grounded in science. It's really, they're doing a lot of twisting of data to make a case in this direction and ignoring a lot of the data there, cherry picking, as we mentioned earlier.
And this is somewhat along those lines. Fats never were the enemy. I think the whole idea about good and bad are ideas we want to really jettison and get rid of, because all these food categories we need, there are valid questions on how much of which, but we need all these things. Yeah. And now I think we've gone so far, we're thinking that fats have these disproportionate tonic magical properties.
Yeah.
And we need fat. We need linoleic and linolenic acid. We get sick without them. But so many fats that are talked about as being good fats are not essential fats. So we hear about how saturated fat, we need it for our cell membranes, we need it for our brain. We do. And that's why we make it. And we make it all day long. And what is in our brain in terms of saturated fat is what we made. It's not what we ate. And so there's this concept that somehow if we need this stuff, the more we eat, the more we have. And it's just not true. There are fats that lacking them, things cannot work. But there's so many other fats to where we can make them our own when we need them. And ultimately, they end up becoming just an empty source of calories because of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, on that point, I think it's worth mentioning that we really need to stop this conversation around carbs and fats. And that fats are good or fats are bad, and carbs are good or carbs are bad. And we really need to start talking about foods, because there's a big difference between blueberries and sweet potatoes versus donuts and soda and potato chips. They're both carb dominant foods, or they're all carb dominant foods, but these have radically different health effects on our body. Mm-hmm. And effects in terms of whether they promote fat gain or fat loss, whether they drive disease or health. And these are radically different things. The same is true in the realm of fats. There's a difference between almonds and avocados and olives versus, butter and margarine and, whatever else, whatever other kinds of refined processed stuff that is generally associated with negative health outcomes. And we need to be really careful with our words, because there's been so much hubbub and just fuss around carbs and fats for 40 years now. And I think to really show to tell a bottom line message of some of the stuff we've talked about, what we're really saying is carbs and fats really don't matter that much. The carb to fat ratio of the diet is not that critical.
For body weight, yeah.
Yeah, but foods matter a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have any thoughts on that?
Couldn't agree more. And along those lines, even the terms low fat, high fat, whatever, those can be so confusing because they're not defined. Actually, they are defined in research, but they're defined and used very differently in popular press. So we had the PURE study, the urban rural epidemiologic large paper that came out about 3-4 weeks ago, a month or so, a couple months ago.
Yeah.
But the headlines were low-fat diets were deadly, and high-carb diets were deadly. And I remember a lot of people who were big low-carb advocates, like, "Oh, this is the holy grail." Like,
see, we told you all along, carbs are bad and fat's good.
We knew it.
Yeah.
And of course, the study and the details what they were defining as a high carb diet was ridiculous. It was basically a rice diet. It was like 75 or more % carbohydrate from processed food.
Right. Yeah. The big confounding variable was they didn't control for socioeconomic variables there.
Mm-hmm.
So you basically had poor people being compared to affluent people, poor people eating basically a diet of nothing but white rice versus affluent people who have much more variety in their diet and vegetables and proteins and things like that. And then you're trying to, from that data with all these confounding variables, then make conclusions about carbs versus fats.
Well, and it was populations that were primarily Asian and also Pacific Island. No, primarily Asian, rural Asian, that's right. But they were then compared to American diets. And so what was high and low in that continuum, they were all over here, and they were comparing that to American diets, which were somewhere completely different. So yeah, I think as you were saying, in terms of body weight, that's just not the most important metric. So protein seems to matter, and having more protein can cut down on just random food cravings, total caloric intake, help metabolic rate, help body composition. So that's a relevant variable. But whether or not you're choosing to fuel from fat or carb, it's pretty straightforward. Your body can do better on some of both. You need good fibers, you need some good fats, you need a lot of vitamins and minerals, and the less processed, the better. You know, oils, you're better off with nuts and seeds, avocados, some healthy animal fats, fish especially. And carbs, same thing. Those that come in intact whole packages that have not been broken up are going to give you the best bang for the buck.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. So let's get into a little bit around insulin resistance now and talk about some of the causes there, because this is another area. It's very much related to some of the stuff we've talked about so far, as far as myths around carbs and fats. But let's talk about the causes of insulin resistance and compare what the science says about the causes versus common beliefs about the causes of insulin resistance.
Well, the common belief is pretty straightforward, that carbs create insulin resistance. Well, that insulin creates insulin resistance. The common narrative is that you eat carbs make insulin. At some point, insulin, your body gets numb to it and just stops listening to it, and because there's too much of it, and it quits working. So that's kind of the common narrative.
If you drink soda, you eat lots of sugar, you do the things that produce insulin, you will eventually cause insulin resistance, diabetes.
And I think it's important to understand what insulin is really doing in the body. You know, it's a signal, and it's really controlling how your body burns different types of fuel. And it's one of several signals that controls whether or not energy moves into the cell. It's not really governing what happens within the cell where the fuel is really burned or partitioned, but it does have some bearing on whether fuel comes into the cell or not.
Yeah, and on that point, I want to add the difference between a part that is necessary for a certain function versus a part that regulates a certain function. So, and this idea that insulin regulates our body fat levels basically is not true. Insulin is not actually any kind of regulating of whether we gain or lose fat. It is one of the necessary components that we need to store fat, or, to have certain levels of insulin that allow us to burn fat, but it doesn't control how much fat we store or burn. To give an analogy here, you need an engine in a car to be able to drive somewhere, but if you don't get in the car and start the engine and press on the accelerator pedal, that car doesn't go anywhere just because it has an engine.
Yeah.
So let's talk about some of these causes of insulin resistance. We have the common idea of what most people believe, and is that true or not?
Well, so to anthropomorphize a little bit, again, the common idea is that there's a mistake, there's a glitch, that something is broken, that there's so much insulin it quits working. And still in this vein of anthropomorphizing, what's really going on is that insulin resistance is not a mistake, it's a strategy. It's your body's way of rejecting fuel when there's too much fuel in the cells already. When there's too much fuel coming in, your body cannot process it. Your liver takes what it can, and it makes glycogen first off. And when that's filled up, it makes triglyceride. But there's a point at where it's just run out of room. And it's a large part of governing that whole body response. And insulin is one of the tools, insulin resistance is one of the tools to reject energy and keep it out in the bloodstream when there's too much. And that's why glucose gets higher and triglycerides and eventually ketones get higher. Your body is rejecting and not burning that energy.
So what's causing that situation?
Well, there's three scenarios. There's just too much fuel coming in, there's not enough fuel being burned, or there's not enough capacity to burn fuel. And we can go deeper in all those.
Yeah, let's do it. So too much fuel coming in, very, very simply, what does that mean?
So that's all these fuels. That's the carbs, the fats, also the alcohols, including the ketones. They still work like fuel. They've got to be processed. And I say that chemically, ketones come under the category of alcohol, but also alcohol itself is still caloric. So to really round out all the fuel sources, that's all of them. And it's all coming down to acetyl-CoA. The cells have to burn it or store it. And if there's more than they can burn in that moment, they have to reject that. It's just dangerous for them not to. The thing that wears us out is just like your car, it's driving the car. The more fuel you run through your body, the quicker you wear things out and the quicker you age. And it creates metabolic stress, it creates free radical damage, even though we need these free radicals to generate energy. So by being in a state of excess fuel, our only safety mechanism is rejecting that fuel. And it's hard on us to have that fuel in the bloodstream. All that glucose, triglyceride, that gunks up our heart, our kidneys, our blood vessels to our retinal tissues. It hurts everything. It creates disease states. So it's at a cost, but it's at a lesser cost than fuel overload within the cell is.
Yeah, and to add one thing there, we have these nutrients that you're saying the cell has to block them, has to keep them out. And just to say why, these things actually become toxic inside of the cell. If too many glucose molecules, too many fatty acid molecules are getting into the cell, it will actually become toxic to the cell. And this is an important point because the cell is basically intentionally blocking the entry of these excess nutrients into the cell. And as a result, we get this situation where now we have excess nutrients floating around the blood, which is also toxic, but I guess less toxic than it is if they're inside the cell.
Just to close out that last loophole, the same stuff applies to ketones as well. So when someone's on a ketogenic diet, that's not a low fuel diet, and they've got these ridiculously high levels of ketones, they think, oh, wow, my body is burning all these ketones. It's got to be amazing. Like, no, you're not burning them. That's why you're peeing them out. And that's why they're building up in your bloodstream. So your body makes ketone resistance the same way that it makes resistance to carbs and to fats when there's just too much fuel there.
Okay, so main cause is basically fuel excess.
So first part of that is fuel excess. Second part of that is not burning enough fuel. And that can be a function of the basal metabolic rate, thyroid hormones, depth of sleep, micronutrient status, circadian cortisol cycles can all tie into that, overall body composition. This is a wild thing, Ari. I read recently about the newer blanket term overfat. So we've got body weight gives us obese and overweight, per BMI. But then we've got this whole thing of TOFI or skinny fat, thin outside, fat inside. And you put that all together as overfat. And there's stats now on this being over 90% of American males.
Wow. And
a little above 80% of American females. Because what we see is that so many people that develop the complications that often go with weight gain, oftentimes they're not heavy. And so the solution is always, well, then they're overfat. They've got too little lean mass. So a lot of our lean mass or muscle tissue contains receptors like GLUT4 receptors, which just suck up fuel. And if we have less muscle tissue or if it's less stimulated, then we cannot tolerate a load of fuel that might otherwise be appropriate.
Fascinating. So what are there any other causes here of insulin resistance that you want to?
Well, the third part about this whole, because these things can work in any combination. And the third part about that is how well we can burn fuel at any given moment. And that comes down to endoplasmic reticulum, mitochondrial function, big thing you've gone real deep into. So even if we've got appropriate amounts of fuel and capacity for it, if at that cellular level we can't function with it right, then there's problems. And lots of reasons why that can happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, the way I kind of tend to list out the causes, I will say number one is being overweight itself. And that goes along with fuel excess. And that, those two states obviously are very much intertwined. But
Can I expand on that just ever so slightly?
please, yeah.
So fat cells are dynamic. They're not like this thing you stuck in there like Scrooge McDuck in his vault where this is all stuck away and it's not doing anything. There's stuff always going into and out of fat cells. And fat cells are always leaking fuel. They're always pouring out triglyceride in the bloodstream. And so one of the other mechanisms of insulin resistance is to try to put a lid on that, try to not have it coming out. So like you're saying, the excess body fat all by itself is creating more of a fuel demand upon the mitochondria, more of that toxic fuel overload.
Yeah, absolutely. And as fat cells grow, as fat cells become bigger, they become less effective at trapping that fuel, those triglycerides inside of the fat cell. So more leak out. And then we have insulin, as you were saying, kind of responding to that. Body's trying to produce more insulin to not have this toxicity of too many triglycerides floating around in the bloodstream. So
you were talking about the causes of mitochondrial dysfunction and
yes, yeah, absolutely. One of the other big ones as far as insulin resistance is sitting, which goes along with not burning enough fuel. But interestingly enough, there's actually research showing that literally within a few hours of being stationary and just sitting down, you can actually see measurable increases in insulin resistance in the body just from sitting. And we normally talk about insulin resistance diabetes as this really big, long-term dynamic process of over the course of years and years and years of eating a certain way and having a certain lifestyle, you eventually become insulin resistant. Well, what's interesting is you can create insulin resistance in a matter of hours by simply not moving your body. And, when that happens, basically the mitochondria don't work as efficiently when they're stationary, and they will intentionally kind of basically create this situation where they're keeping fuel out of the cell, like we were talking about earlier.
The ultimate setup for that is think about traveling. So your sleep is goofed up. The sleep is a big part of that too. You can create insulin resistance by skipping a lot of a night's sleep. So you're not sleeping right, and now you're holding still for like all day long, and
Yeah, absolutely. So, and then there's research showing that alcohol consumption can contribute to insulin resistance, sleep deprivation, circadian rhythm disruption, psychological stress, tobacco, smoking can cause insulin resistance. So, basically what I want to get across here to everyone listening is that insulin resistance is not simply a matter of that you had too many candies and soda and carbs.
Yeah.
There's a lot of research indicating that there are many factors that lead into this. And I will also add that there's actually research that if I wanted to cherry pick, I could go find you 50 studies saying saturated fat causes insulin resistance. And there's actually research showing that higher fat consumption can contribute to insulin resistance, just as there's research showing that refined sugar consumption can create insulin resistance. Now, my point there is not to say it's really fat that's doing it. I do not think that dietary fat is the primary driver of insulin resistance, nor do I think it's carbs. I'm
going to goad you on a little bit. So what do they do with animals when they want to induce insulin resistance or induce obesity? What kind of a program do they put them on?
Yeah, they put them on a high-fat diet.
Every time.
I mean, this is a remarkable thing when you start to look at the animal research is that when they want to create obesity, when they want to create insulin resistance, they almost always use a high-fat diet to induce those effects. And yet simultaneously, we have this world of online health, where all these people are teaching, these nutrition gurus are teaching, you need to go high-fat in order to have amazing health. And so again, I think that emphasizes that there's really a gap here between what the science is saying and what popular ideas are.
So having some insulin on board tells your liver basically to utilize carbs for fuel if you've got carbs. But that insulin resistance, again, it's blocking fuel, and it'll also block fat. So fat and triglyceride overloads can still create insulin resistance, even though dietary fat has less of an impact upon insulin secretion. And one more thing along these lines too, insulin's been vilified. It's this bad thing we've got to get rid of or reject. And sadly, it's so critical for many functions. overall, if we're insulin deficient, we become infertile. Our output of gonadal hormones, from the testicles from guys or ovaries for women, that all shuts down. And in the context of evolution, low levels of insulin only occurs if there's no fuel. There's not enough food available. So it makes sense why reproduction would be impaired. Also, thyroid hormone just shuts off. So I've got a friend who's one of the nutritionists behind the Barrows Neurologic Center that's done most of the research on ketogenic diets in kids with epilepsy. And they know just predictably that even within a few weeks into it, these kids develop thyroid disease. They become hypothyroid. And they often preemptively start thyroid treatment because they know this is going to show up. So also just glutathione production, making antioxidants, muscle growth, lots of important things you need insulin for.
Yeah, absolutely. And you just reminded me of something that I meant to say much earlier, but I'm going to say now because I think it's really important. We have this idea that's very popular that carbs are uniquely insulin stimulating and insulin is only stimulated by carbs. I'm going to tell everyone who's listening right now something that is so shocking that you will probably think that I'm crazy and that I'm totally wrong. So I will encourage you all to actually look up the research for yourself. Basically, there's research showing that protein-containing foods can be as insulinogenic, as stimulating to insulin, as many carb-containing foods. So beef, fish, cheese, which most people would think these are low-carb foods, these are not stimulating any insulin, they actually stimulate as much insulin per calorie as, believe it or not, something like pasta or porridge, grain-based foods. Whey protein, which is a protein powder that's commonly used in the fitness industry, commonly used by many extremely fit people who are very lean and who have no problem with being overweight, is as stimulating to insulin as white bread is. So, hopefully, probably a lot of people listening just had their minds blown. Probably don't believe me. Again, look up the research for yourself.
Go Google insulin index.
Yes.
Index. You can find this online. It's straightforward.
Yeah. So protein stimulates insulin. And there's basically no way to avoid insulin. Unless you want to eat only, I was going to say only butter, but butter is actually slightly insulinogenic too.
Also, there's what causes you to secrete insulin, and there's what causes insulin resistance. Mm-hmm. And if you've got any kind of a fuel overload, you'll reach a state of insulin resistance. So if you do a low fuel diet and it's a high fat diet, or it's not a high fat diet, if you do low fuel, you can reverse insulin resistance. And if you do zero carb, you can decrease insulin secretion to a point. But at some point, it's actually counterproductive. And really, you need to be on more ketogenic to see it drop that low to get those types of problems show up.
Yeah, I thank you for mentioning that. That was the point that I meant to go into. So let me ask you directly, do you need to go low carb to reverse insulin resistance? How do you reverse it?
So it's just low fuel. So your body is creating insulin resistance to fight off extra fuel. So if you lower the total intake of fuel below that magic threshold, and we talked about a lot of ways by which your body may not burn fuel well, but there's still some threshold. There's still some point right now to where if you've got less than what your needs are, your body will start accepting fuel. And there's a little bit of a shift that happens in that. This is some stuff coming from the coming book, and I'm eager to share more of this with you too in person, but the liver is storing glycogen and triglyceride. And what seems to happen is that the endoplasmic reticulum become damaged and fuel goes into and out of glycogen, into and out of triglyceride. The damage in the pathology is that fuel coming out of triglyceride, that's stuck. This becomes a one-way street. So extra fuel, at some point glycogen is filled, and you don't have room for all that much glycogen. It's not a very efficient, dense source of fuel compared to triglyceride. So that overflow goes to triglyceride. But somewhere along the way, you can't tap out of your hepatic triglycerides as well as you could tap in. And then they actually crowd out glycogen. They physically occupy so much space in the cells, you don't have as much room for glycogen. And then you're losing a lot of your ability to fine tune your blood sugar throughout the day because you don't have that glycogen to draw from moment by moment.
Ah, fascinating. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So low fuel will reverse insulin resistance.
So I say fuel for two reasons. One of which is because we need to clean our ears about the word calorie. we've been so brainwashed, like just plug our ears when we hear the word calorie and like run away screaming, you know?
Yeah.
So that's one reason.
Oh, you said calories. You must not know what you're talking about, because calories have already been debunked, and really
Right.
it's been shown to be all about insulin, right?
Exactly.
And
So that's,
I'm speaking,
that's,
just to clarify, I'm not speaking as me. I'm speaking as someone who, has been listening to too much of the online health people.
so that's one reason, but the other one is because protein is a caloric source, but it does have a distinct effect. So even in some of these pathways in the liver, it does work differently. So yeah, so carbs, fats, ketones, alcohol compounds, collectively, I think of those as fuel, and it's really high fuel, low fuel. Protein's a little different. We got to like get past the calorie stuff. So that's why I've been using that term more and more.
Yeah. And just to add a little bit on that point, there's research showing that basically any low fuel diet, whether it is low carb, high fat, or it's Mediterranean, moderate carb, moderate fat, or a vegan, high carb, low fat diet, if it's low fuel, if it's low calorie, it can reverse insulin resistance. And we have actually studies showing that these diets can reverse diabetes, they can reverse insulin resistance. And it doesn't matter. It does not have to be low carb, high fat in order to do this.
So do you want to blow people away a lot and talk about the rice diet?
Oh yeah, we talked about this a couple months ago when we were sitting at that table for lunch at Mindshare, and people were like, "No, you guys,
I'm making this up."
Yeah, go ahead.
What was his name? The researcher, it was at Duke University.
Yeah, Duke University. William Kempner, I believe.
Awesome, you're right, Kempner. Yeah. So he first went into this trying to treat hypertension, high blood pressure. And his speculation was that it was all about sodium. And so how do you get, not even just like no salt on the table, but how do you get like only the foods are the lowest in salt? That was his original intent. And so he pretty much built a diet that was white rice, fruit juice, sugar. That's about it, right? And the intent was to get adequate calories, but crazy low in sodium. And it was all about blood pressure at first, but over the years, he saw so many reversals of late-stage congestive heart failure, diabetes, huge amounts of weight loss amongst the morbidly obese. So, but again, a lot of diabetes reversal on this diet that was just all processed carbohydrate. That's all that it was.
Yeah, let me emphasize that for people. This is a diet of white rice, orange juice, and refined sugar, I believe, actually like table sugar.
Yeah.
And they were showing, it was calorie restricted, and they were showing on that diet, which nobody today would consider that a healthy, balanced, nutritious diet by any stretch of the imagination. And most people would think that this is a diet that is destined to cause fat gain and diabetes.
It should be deadly for diabetics.
Yeah. And instead, they actually were documenting cases of obesity reversal, diabetes reversal on that diet. I mean, that's mind-blowing. And this is all documented. If you guys want to look up the rice diet, you can read up more on that. I'll put some links on the show notes page for this episode as well.
Do you know the only reason that Duke stopped researching the rice diet?
I don't.
Because of the sex scandals.
Oh, really? I didn't know anything about that.
Oh, the guy, he had a full-on cult. He had a full-on cult and harem. And
ah, nice. Well, yeah, I mean, why be in a position of power if you're not going to abuse it,
That's totally what he did. It was bizarre. But that's why it all went sideways. It had nothing to do with the effectiveness.
Wow, that's funny. I didn't know that. So I'm trying to think where else we can go with this. Oh, let's talk about non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. What's going on there as far as the causes of that, and how does it relate to carbs and fats in the diet?
Well, so that's a big one. We might have to get a couple sections on this. We could talk about chronic disease in general, including that. We can talk about a lot of other variables on this.
You know what? Maybe since I think we've gone almost an hour and a half now, maybe we'll save this for a part 2. We still have a bunch of things that I think would be useful to cover. And if that one's a deeper one that, requires some time to really explore, let's save it.
Yeah. Can I throw a teaser out about that topic? So
by all means, yeah.
This is something that has been thought about as a rather obscure version of liver disease for some time in the medical world. But that whole thing about overfat that I talked about, this is how it starts. So when your liver's working great, you've got room to take on this extra fuel, store it, put it out and burn it. And most of us had at least one point where when we were kids, we didn't watch what we ate or how much we did, and it was all fine, but we never got the exact right amount of food. We never were spot on for our day's caloric needs or fuel needs, whichever word we're going to use. We were never spot on. So when we've got healthy liver function, I call that metabolic flexibility. Any fuel overage, you got a place to hold on to that harmlessly. And on the other hand, the days where maybe you don't get as much and you played around the block more than usual, any fuel deficit, you can compensate for that. You've got this little buffer you have of throw in the extra fuel, pull out the extra fuel, your energy stays steady, you don't crash when you have a little bit less food, and you don't have your weight go crazy when you've got a little bit more food. So that not working right is the overfat. And for various reasons, some people have more fat in the viscera than under the skin and elsewhere. And then also that same complication creates so much fat that you get about more than 5% of the liver's volume displaced as fat. And now it can't work as well. We go into fatty liver disease, non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, full-on cirrhosis. There's this whole continuum. And the actual disease state, not just a little bit too much in the overfat, the actual disease state, by best evidence, that's at least 40% of American adults in that full-on disease states.
Wow. Fascinating. Yeah, I can't wait to dig into that a little deeper with you. Yeah,
that'll be a blast.
Yeah, well, this has been so much fun. I have to say, this is probably the most fun podcast I've ever done. So thank you so much. And I'm super excited to get into part 2 with you. I'll email you and we'll schedule part 2 for this.
Likewise, it'll be a lot of fun.
We may have to do a part 7 series on carbs and fat myth debunking. Episode only 3.5 hours long. All right, Dr. C, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I can't wait till the next time.
Likewise. Bye-bye.
All right, bye.